Today we are talking about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. It's a difficult topic to cover. Uh, Parts of this will not be appropriate for young children, although I think teenagers should be all right if they've had some background in the Holocaust. And it's a scary topic. It's an unpleasant topic. However, in the Talmud, it's one of the three things that a rabbi is instructed to teach somebody who is asking to convert, which is why I think it's important if you are converting to Judaism, this is a must-have course. And in addition, if you're trying to just understand Judaism, understand the history, what it means to be Jewish, this is an important part of being Jewish. It's not something that we love to talk about, although we find ways to do so that are sometimes healthy and sometimes unhealthy, um, as we talk about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust today. To understand anti-Semitism, we need to understand the history of anti-Semitism. Here's the reason for that. The way that anti-Semitism operates is almost like a living thing of its own. It's almost like this creature that seems to go to sleep temporarily and then rear its ugly head once again. The nature of anti-Semitism is cyclical and additive, meaning it moves in cycles, it repeats, and each time it repeats, whatever existed before is brought back up, and whatever new versions or iterations of anti-Semitism emerge become attached to this wheel that keeps turning around, and they in turn will come back. So that's what I mean. It is cyclical and it is additive. To understand anti-Semitism today, we need to go all the way back to the Hellenistic period of Judea. In the Hellenistic world, the Greeks, Romans, Persians, and Egyptians were all polytheists. When they conquered a people, they didn't expect the conquered people to give up their native gods, but they did expect them to adopt their own gods, the foods and customs of the conquerors. Jews were the only monotheistic people that existed in the world at that time. And so when Jews refused to adopt the gods of their conquerors, they were viewed as troublemakers. Why wouldn't you just adopt the gods of your conquerors? Clearly, our gods are just as good, if not better than your gods, because we defeated you in battle. Moreover, Jews never gave up on the promise of a sovereign Jewish king over Judea, which was called the Messiah. Nowadays, when we use the term Messiah, we use it in a very different way than the Jews of Greek Judea, who understood the Messiah as a political figure, as an individual who would unite the people of Israel, the peoples of the land of Israel, unite Judea with the surrounding Israelite areas, and to rule over as an independent king. This goes all the way back to King David, who was the venerated king and the recognized line of succession. Because Jews never gave up on this idea of having a Messiah, having Mashiach, which again at that time meant having a human king, none of the supernatural assumptions that we make today about Mashiach, that led to a tendency among Jews to be rebellious. And its very origin The idea of a Messiah is the idea of an independent Jewish state. That's what it means to have a Messiah. Jews refused to assimilate. There were numerous uprisings, power struggles, and through all of these, the Jews continually lost. The only victory we can attribute to the Maccabees. The only victory we can attribute to the Maccabees, which was, as it turns out, short-lived. As a result of this, Jews were viewed by the Romans, by the Greeks, as foreigners who could not be trusted because they would not assimilate into Greek culture or Roman culture, and because we had a tendency to strive for independence, which led to uprisings and rebellions. They were also considered at that time because of the alliances that Jews would form with outside enemy nations. For example, the Maccabees forming alliances with the Romans and with the Spartans against Greece. There became the idea that Jews were traitorous in their nature. And remember, at this time, this is an independent or semi-independent region of Judea. That's where the word Jew comes from. In 135, the Romans demolished Jerusalem and renamed Judea Syria Palestina after the Philistines, who were the historic enemy of Judea. By renaming Judea to Syria Palestina, the Romans created an association and a humiliation for the Jews that they were to be named after their greatest historic rival. Keep these in mind because these are the beginnings of anti-Semitism that will continue to iterate over and over throughout the centuries. Moving forward to the 1st through 3rd century, and by the way, this discussion focuses mostly on European anti-Semitism, which, is not the only form of anti-Semitism, but it is the most pernicious form, and it is today the dominant force of anti-Semitism in the world. But we'll talk about what anti-Semitism looks like today by the end of the lesson. Because of the rebellious nature of the Jews in Judea, early Christians sought to distance themselves from Jews. In particular, in Rome, where Christians were already being persecuted, they had an incentive to make it clear that they were not part of the Jews, they were not related to the Jews, that the Christians agreed with the Romans that the Jews were a rebellious people, that they agreed with the Romans that the Jews were a despicable people, and therefore the Christians should not be persecuted on behalf of the Jews or in association with the Jews. Some of these anti-Jewish attitudes made their way into Christian scripture and into Christian myth. The idea that Jesus was killed at the demand of a Jewish mob, the idea that the Pharisees, who were the precursors to the rabbis, were greedy money changers who cared more about tithes, that is money, than serving God. Moving forward a few hundred years, we come upon the Crusades. In 1095, by the way, the words that are in bold are the concepts you should remember. I don't need you to remember every date, every historical period. This is not a history class, but it is important to understand our history in order to understand our present. If you take note of any of the terms that are in bold, that will give you an idea of where the evolution of anti-Semitism occurs. So in 1095, there was a war that was beginning or was ongoing in what the Christians called the Holy Land between the Muslims and between the Christians, as which we won't get into, the causes of that. Again, it's not a history class. But in the course of this war, Pope Urban called on all of the peoples of the Holy Roman Empire, which covered a good portion of Europe, to come and fight in what was called the Holy Land, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Well, the Holy Roman Empire, as my history teacher, as many history teachers have said, was not holy, was not Roman, and was not an empire. When we say the Holy Roman Empire, you should really think of Germany, or modern-day Germany and some surrounding areas, including northern Italy, parts of France, etc. This was the Holy Roman Empire, and they were not nearby to the Turks or the Arabs that they were going to fight. They had to cross the continent before they could get there. On their way marching across, these mobs who had armed themselves and were marching off to fight halfway around the world to fight heretics in the Holy Land came across Jewish settlements and thought to themselves, well, hey, why should we travel, 5,000 miles to go kill heretics halfway around the world when we've got heretics right here in our backyard and we can kill them? So having been brought up into this frenzy by the church, who had this idea that anyone who wouldn't acknowledge Jesus as Christ, that's the definition of a Christian, someone who recognizes Jesus as Christ, which is the Greek word for Mashiach, for anointed ruler, were heretics, and they could only be saved through death. I'm oversimplifying a lot of these early Christian, or not early Christian, a lot of these medieval Christian concepts, just for the sake of time. But the church actually tried to, in most cases, protect the Jewish communities. At worst, they did nothing. They did not encourage the attacks on Jewish communities, but because of the rhetoric that they had generated against Muslims, Jews ended up being attacked because the mobs were taught to fight anyone who wasn't Christian. And the church was not powerful enough, not fast enough to intervene on behalf of the Jews, who actually had, in general at that time, good relations with the church. These mobs who attacked communities sought to convert or kill any Jews that they came across. And they believed that any Jews who refused to convert, because they believed in the sacred cause they were fighting for, anybody who was opposed to them must be in league with the devil. That's the only explanation why somebody would not convert and submit to Christ. Going forward just a little bit in history, the blood libel is a major keystone of anti-Semitism, and it begins in England in the 12th century. Eventually it spreads over the following centuries to most of Europe, but it is the idea that Jews perform some types of blood rituals by sacrificing Christians, or especially Christian babies. Probably the most common form of this is the belief that Jews use the blood of Christian babies in their unleavened bread for Passover, in matzah, that's part of the recipe for matzah. Obviously, there's not even a tiny grain of truth to this. There's not even uh, any type of Jewish custom that could be interpreted as this, but it was something that people became convinced of. There are other examples of well poisonings that were blamed on Jewish communities, probably unsanitary conditions. Whenever there were unexplained deaths, the Jews were blamed, and sometimes Jews were even executed in mass. An entire town might be attacked and razed and ravaged. The attitude at this time was that Jews were meant to be suffering, that Jews were meant to be dehumanized, isolated, despised, despicable, because the Jews became the living relic in the eyes of the church of what it means to reject Christ. So as the church is expanding and as the church is solidifying its hold on Europe, the narrative that accepting Jesus as Christ is the only way to prosperity. If there are people living among you who are prosperous, who don't accept Jesus as Christ, then you've got a problem with your narrative. People might say, oh, well, the Jews seem to be doing all right. So it was actually in the interest of local governments to make sure that the Jews were miserable, so that they could serve as an example of what happens to people who reject Jesus as Christ. You can find a lot of artwork from this time that depicts Jews as having horns, having tails. I've met, nobody has personally asked me if I have horns, but I have met many people alive today who have been asked in their lifetime, where are your horns? I thought all Jews had horns. This is a pervasive belief that continues, yes, even today in the 21st century. I know it sounds so absurd and so far-fetched. You think, that's, 1,000 years ago, people were stupid. No, it still is happening today. One of the great explanations for that particular myth is that there's a mistranslation regarding Moses that said beams of light after Moses spoke with God. Beams of light were coming from his head, but the Hebrew word keren for beams of light is very close to the word for horns, and so it was mistranslated that Moses had horns, and very famously depicted in, was it Michelangelo Sculpture? Michelangelo did David. Did he do Moses too? I'm seeing somebody nod. I got a thumbs up. All right. Michelangelo's Moses, you can see the horns. Jews were depicted as something somewhere in between human and animal. This is also the beginning of the forced debates, the dispositions, as they were called, in which Jews were forced to debate the Talmud with Christians in public forums to expose Judaism as a barbaric, secretive, and insincere religion, where Christians would say, look at these, terrible passages of the Talmud that describe, circumcision, for example, which was considered a barbaric practice and proof that the Jews were a barbaric people. Although we know that circumcision is a harmless, minor surgical procedure, that it's safer than having your tooth pulled, somewhere, worse than a bad sunburn, somewhere in there. Easier than having your appendix removed. That Jews were secretive because these practices were not out in the open. uh, because Jews were forced to live in isolated societies. And most importantly, that Judaism was insincere because, of course, there are passages of the Talmud that contradict other passages of the Talmud. That's the nature of the Talmud as a forum of discussion. But the Christians who were manipulating these debates used that as evidence that Jews didn't actually practice what the Talmud said, because for every passage that says one thing, you could find a different passage that says something else. So how could this possibly be a sincere religion? This brings us forward to the Inquisition, starting in 1492 and continuing. Look at the end date here. This is not insignificant. A lot of people think that the Inquisition, started in 1492, and by 1500 it was done. It was a one-time thing. No, it was an ongoing policy for hundreds of years. Originally founded by the church to root out heretics within the church, they created the Inquisition, which ended up being turned against Jews in particular. Medieval Jews were legally limited to a few professions. Jews were prohibited from owning farmland and prohibited from joining most trades. However, they could become merchants and financiers, which was especially valuable to the ruling class because Christians were not permitted to loan money. The church's interpretation of the doctrine was that Christians could not lend money. But as we all know, in this age, I think just about everybody has a credit card, everybody has a credit line, a mortgage, a car payment. I don't think that there's somebody who goes through their entire life without any debt. Student loans. I try not to think about my student loans. Everybody in modern day society has access to credit, and we're able to use credit to advance our lives in meaningful ways. There are a number of charities that, including Jewish charities and non-Jewish charities, that actually use microloans, which are loans of under $1,000, to give to people in places that don't have any access to credit, so that you can start a business if you're in a remote area or a third world country, to have access to credit to start a business and then to grow. We know that finance is an important part of modern society, and that access to credit is the only or one of the most important ways for an individual or a nation to develop. This is why every institution, cities and counties and countries, issue bonds. That's another type of finance. Well, Christians were not allowed to engage in this, but Jews were. According to the church, Christians could put their money in the trust of a Jewish individual who could then act on their behalf, who could loan and borrow, who could charge interest, and it was one of the few occupations that was available to Jews living in Christian Europe. Jews who converted by force, who were called conversos or anusim, even after they converted, were considered suspects, kept in isolated communities. Sometimes those communities were given permission to emigrate from Spain or Portugal or other areas where the Inquisition was happening, where they went to Amsterdam or South America or Turkey. Sometimes these conversos were allowed to emigrate, but often they were kept in isolated communities because they were considered suspects, that they could turn back to the horrors of Judaism at any time. They were also barred from public service and could have their property confiscated by the crown. So even the Jews who chose to convert It's sort of like, darned if you do, darned if you don't. The Reformation. Martin Luther very famously, pinned a note on the door of the church that said, these are the problems in the church. Here's how we're going to fix them. Ended up, we don't know if what that was his original intention, but ended up establishing a new branch of Christianity called Lutherans or Protestant because they protested against the church. This great informed leader who was opposed to corruption in the church, who was opposed to the church remaining in the Dark Ages, wanted to advance the thinking, advance the democratization of religion. In so many ways, a very progressive force in Europe, nevertheless called the Jews a rejected and condemned people. It was under Luther and those who followed after him that the Christian theology of supersessionism spread, which basically the argument of supersessionism is that Judaism was at one point a valid religion, but because in Christian theology, God sent his son, and in Christian theology, it's almost always his son, to alleviate the sins of the world, that Judaism was no longer necessary. It was outdated. It was monotheism 1.0 and Christianity was monotheism 2.0. That Christianity superseded Judaism. Judaism was redundant and obsolete. The only purpose for Judaism to exist in the theology of supersessionism is that Judaism paved the way for Christianity, that all of Judaism and all of our sacred texts are in fact only in service to directing the world toward the coming of Jesus. This was meant to be a rational argument as opposed to earlier medieval arguments that were never even depicted as rational. This was meant to be surely any rational person could see how much better Christianity is and how obviously if Judaism existed and contained these texts that talk about the coming of a Messiah, then clearly Jews should reasonably accept Jesus. And if they don't, they must have some irrational reason for doing so. They must be evil. Jews were considered unindustrious because we were barred from certain trades, and so we favored banking and study or trading over working in the fields. The idea in Protestantism and in Puritanism, which came later, that a person's value is connected with how industrious they are, meaning how hard they work on the land to grow food, was built into Protestant Christianity early on. Jews, because again, we were not permitted to own land in many of these countries, and so we ended up taking on the trades of our parents, which included banking, study, merchants, etc. Over working in the field. Jews were considered unindustrious. In 1516, the city of Venice opened the first ghetto to isolate Jews and control the city. Expulsions elsewhere in Europe continued, and in fact, it's accelerated over this period. The word ghetto, by the way, it's an Italian word, and it means um, when you make steel. I don't know the English word. When you produce steel, there's the slag, I think is the word, that's left over um, after you separate all of the good metal um, parts from the junk, the impurities, the slag. And they would dump it in this particular part of the city, which was called the ghetto. That's the word ghetto means the slag. And that was the area of the city that, because nobody else wanted it, they said, okay, Jews, you can go and live there. By the way, if you ever travel in Europe, you can still go to Venice, you can still go to the ghetto, which has been remarkably well preserved for hundreds of years, and you can see all of this for yourself. Racing forward through history, we come to the Enlightenment. You'd think that maybe the Enlightenment would bring more enlightened times and happier times for Jews. And in some ways it did. This is the first time period in history. We're talking the 16 and 1700s, 300 or 400 years ago. Before 300 or 400 years ago, at the earliest, Jews were not citizens of any countries that we lived in other than Judea. Jews living in Spain were not considered Spaniards. Jews living in Germany were not considered Germans. Jews living in Russia were not considered Russians. Only after the Enlightenment did citizenship become available to Jews. But it came with several large asterisks. Jews who maintained their religious practice were considered primitive, because Enlightenment was all about casting off superstitions, casting off historic practices, and embracing reason. And so any Jews who were still putting on tefillin, who were still practicing kashrut, were considered primitive. Again, you see how this is moving in a cycle. Or Jews who participated in the modern society, or the pre-modern society at this time, the Enlightenment society, were viewed as counter-revolutionaries who could not be fully trusted because they had the favor of the crown. Again, because of this relationship between Jewish communities that were permitted to operate finance for the crown. They were employed by the crown as bankers, so they were considered counter-revolutionaries. They were part of the ruling class by extension, and so they couldn't be trusted. In fact, Jewish emancipation was contingent upon the release of debts, because that was considered, Jews were considered part of the establishment. There were, at this point in time, non-Jews who also participated in debts, but the same requirement was not applied to them. Big surprise. Jews, in some cases, could become citizens, as I mentioned. Now, I do want to point out here, while we're talking about the Enlightenment, that the idea of the rebellious Jew is now being subverted and inverted. Now the Jews are part of the establishment. Jews are counter-revolutionaries. They're part of the established order, and they're enemies of the rebellion. You see how, just by shifting that context, the concept of what Jews were doing is resurrected in this new form that finds a new way to make sure that Jews are the ones who are opposed criticized, in some cases killed, that they are the enemies of the good people of society, quote unquote. The YouTube is probably going to take this thing down. I don't know if I'm allowed to say some of this stuff on YouTube. They'll think that I'm advocating for it when I'm describing it, you know, as so that you know what exists out there. In the early 1800s until the early 1900s, a large portion of the Jewish population of Europe was in the Russian Federation, or the Russian Empire, rather, but not the Russian Federation, the Russian Empire, which established the Pale of Settlement. This was an area in sort of modern day Russia, Ukraine, Poland, where Jews were permitted to live. Jews who were living in cities at that time in Russia were expelled from the cities in many cases and sent to go live in the Pale of Settlement. It wasn't quite the same as being sent like to Siberia. There certainly is plenty good arable land in this area, but it was sending Jews away from the population centers to some of the more distant rural areas of the Russian Empire. There were special laws. Jews were barred from many trades. This should sound familiar, as well as owning land and farming. Again, this should sound familiar. But Jews were permitted to operate taverns, to collect taxes, and to trade as merchants. Landowners and the Russian government fomented pogroms to both prevent Jews from gaining too much financial power and to release political unrest. What is a pogrom? It is a state-sponsored mob event. Basically, when there was too much criticism against the state from the peasantry, there was a threat of an uprising. They would say, look, it's not our fault that you're miserable. It's these Jews that are feeding you alcohol and collecting taxes. You've got to go and attack them. When the large landowners were in a position where there was political unrest and they were afraid of an uprising, you could let out a little bit of steam and say, you got to organize and go fight against those Jews over there because they're the real villains. Meanwhile, those in power could dodge any sort of criticism by shifting any blame or rage onto Jews. Pogroms were motivated by political and economic tensions, as well as blood libel accusations. So throughout this time, there were even periods where there were pogroms that emerged spontaneously, that were not politically motivated, that emerged because somebody said the Jews are going to kill our children, or the Jews are killing our children, or the Jews are causing this disease that's affecting our town, or whatever it might be. The Jews are poisoning the well, or they're going to poison the well. People would get whipped up into a frenzy and go out and attack the closest Jewish towns and settlements. Taverns were also considered by the Eastern Orthodox Church, were considered to be purveyors of vice. Remember this one, because it will come up again and again. Jews were accused of being conspirators and radicals against the establishment. This should sound familiar because we've seen that before. In the early 20th century, Russians authored Russian authors, excuse me, compiled and distributed the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. If you have not heard of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, it is one of the most pervasive, most seditious anti-Semitic documents ever created. It is a forgery that is purporting to be a copy of the Jews' secret plot to rule the world. It masquerades as the handbook to take over the world, that's said to be distributed to every Jew or to an elite cadre of Jews who are attempting to rule the world by controlling the media, by manipulating financial institutions, and infiltrating governments. The story of how that came to be and how it came to be distributed is as horrifying as it is disgusting, but that's probably for another time entirely. So now we're in the 20th century. The great anti-Semitic event of the 20th century, of course, is the rise of Nazi Germany and the carrying out of the Holocaust. Nazi Germany developed, along with racial theory, which was developed throughout the Western world at this time, including in America, the idea that there are multiple races and that there are differences between races that are physiological, that certain races of people are naturally predisposed to be more intelligent, to be more kind, to be more athletic, to be more XYZ. This was a prevailing scientific theory of the first half of the 20th century. Along with this theory of race came the idea that races should be managed or directed by eliminating inferior genes. So this was the beginning of scientific anti-Semitism. So just like in Spain, in the Inquisition, when Jews who converted were still not free of persecution, Jews in Nazi Germany were, because Judaism was considered to be an innate, genetic, physiological aspect of somebody's existence, all of these previous accusations against Jews, that Jews are unproductive, that Jews are manipulative or sneaky, that Jews are rebellious, that Jews are untrustworthy. All of these, the argument became that all of these were physiological traits that Jews simply could not help. And therefore, that is what made Jews as a race, according to Nazi Germany, dangerous. Nazi propaganda portrayed Jews as global manipulators, as war profiteers, as shapeshifters, and subhumans, often depicted as animals such as leeches, octopi, rats, dogs, pigs. Of course, the anti-Semitic actions of the anti-Semitic attitudes of the Nazis culminated in the Holocaust, the Shoah. The word Shoah is the Hebrew word for Holocaust. I will use them interchangeably, and you'll hear them used interchangeably as well. So to understand, how could the Holocaust have happened? We first have to understand Germany's defeat and humiliation after World War I. Germany was required to pay tremendous reparations to other European nations who were involved in World War I. Excuse me. Germany, as part of the treaty, was required to operate a democratic Weimar Republic that many Germans viewed as illegitimate, that it was imposed by an external force. As we know, especially those of you who grew up in the United States, where this is often a policy of American diplomacy, to institute democracy in foreign countries often does not work because it's viewed as illegitimate. It's viewed as an imposed government. There's a period of hyperinflation, which meant that the money was unstable and unreliable. Even if you could find and keep work, your earnings were immediately deprecated to the point where survival was a challenge for many Germans. Well, in this state of affairs, Jews made for an easy scapegoat. Jews were often depicted as either, this is pre-Nazi era, either as state-destroying communists, because there were many prominent communists who were also Jews, or as arch capitalists who were draining the economy from the hardworking German people. This gave way to the rise of Hitler. There's a lot that we could say about Hitler, but the most important thing to walk away is that Hitler is uniquely evil in history. There is no other figure that you can point to who was so manipulative of his own people, who systematically and ideologically rounded up an entire civilization of people, multiple races of people, for a systematic and for systematic extermination of an entire people. There is no one other than Hitler who did all of those things and also invaded surrounding countries in order to incorporate, in order to wipe out their own Jews from neighboring countries. It is far, far, far too common in contemporary discourse to hear somebody that we disagree with compared to Hitler or compared to Nazis. That is virtually always a tremendous misstep, apart from being, I think, a lazy argument, because it diminishes how uniquely evil Hitler and his Nazi Germany truly were. After Hitler rose to power, schools and businesses were segregated so that Jewish students were no longer allowed to attend public schools, were forced to attend Jewish schools, and then the Jewish schools were later closed down. Businesses that were owned by Jews were marked, Jewish customers were marked. Positions in businesses, government institutions, universities were systematically denied to anybody who was Jewish. This policy culminated in Kristallnacht, which was November 9th and 10th of 1938. The Night of Broken Glass, as it's called, in which there were massive anti-Jewish riots in which Jewish homes and businesses were systematically uh, destroyed. It's called the Night of Broken Glass because store windows were busted out. There was glass everywhere. Synagogues were burned down. Jewish homes were attacked. That this was throughout um, uh, this area that that was under the influence of the Nazis. There's the expansion of the Nazi Empire. Again, this is not a history course, but probably you know about Hitler's invasion of Poland, uh, expanded influence in France, in Italy, in um, Czechoslovakia, in all of these different areas across Europe. The next step was the concentration and relocation of Jews. Wherever Jews were living, they were brought into concentration camps, which at least originally, or at least on as they were described to the Jews and to the public, were for the purpose of concentrating the population to keep the Jews in one place, which was depicted at the time for the protection of the German people and also for the protection of the Jews. The most prominent example of this project of concentration is probably the Warsaw Ghetto. There was an average of um, one person for every 3 feet in the Warsaw Ghetto. Hugely overpopulated. There was not enough food. There was survival was questionable. These escape was impossible. These conditions led to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, which, by the way, is still reflected in um, our Jewish identity, and in particular, Jewish Israeli identity. The idea that Jews were, as it was described after the Shoah, led like lambs to the slaughter, in fact, was not true. There were many Jews who took up arms and who fought against the oppressors, but just there were not enough of us and with not enough allies to find victory. 7,000 Jews were killed in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. After that, Warsaw Ghetto was eliminated, was evacuated, and Jews, not just in Warsaw but all over Europe, were shipped to Auschwitz and other death camps, which were no longer concentration camps, no longer labor camps, but were camps that existed for the sole purpose of executing what Hitler called the final solution, of wiping out the entire Jewish population of Europe. Over the course of the Holocaust, the Shoah, there were more than 40,000 camps that were constructed. Jewish towns and homes were razed to the ground. Jewish cemeteries were destroyed. Synagogues were dismantled. Any semblance of that Jews had existed in a place was erased. When you go to towns in Europe now, you can find these abandoned areas or these areas that have been totally converted that used to be Jewish towns. By the end of 1945, 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, as well as 5 million others, which included Roma, which used to be incorrectly called by gypsies, including Roma, Slavs, anybody with disabilities, physical disabilities, mental disabilities. anybody who was black, anyone LGBT, any Jehovah's Witnesses and political opponents of the Nazis were all rounded up, put into these camps, and 5 million non-Jews were murdered as well. All told, nearly 7 out of 10 Jewish Europeans were killed in the Holocaust. I'm going to continue to contemporary anti-Semitism. We know that at the end of the day, the Nazis lost the war. The final solution was not completed, that ultimately the Jewish people did survive, although tremendously diminished from what it had been before. So this leads us to contemporary anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism that we experience today, here, and now. There are many, many different sources and forms of contemporary anti-Semitism, from neo-Nazis, from conspiracy theories about globalists, which is often used as a code word for Jews, from Jewish erasure, just like the Nazis sought to wipe out any evidence of Jewish existence in an area. We see this happening in all sorts of different settings today. The denial of Jewish existence, the erasure of Jewish existence, or minimization of the presence of a Jewish voice. We see lots of examples of this. Holocaust denial, following the exposure of the Holocaust in full, which happened, it was not overnight, it was not 1945, the war ended in 1946, everybody understood the Holocaust. It was a process that took decades for people to really understand. It wasn't until the 1970s that people understood exactly what the Holocaust was, how it was executed, and the extent of the destruction. And so there are a key component of contemporary anti-Semitism has been Holocaust denial. The idea that the Holocaust either did not happen or was highly exaggerated, because in order for Jews to win world sympathy and to manipulate world policy. That's the motivation behind Holocaust. You might think, why would anyone deny the Holocaust? We might all want to. We might want to believe that something so horrible couldn't happen. But the incentive is, if the Holocaust didn't happen, then anything that any protections that have been given to the Jewish people as a result of the Holocaust are illegitimate. From the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948, there have been boycotts against Israel. The first was the Arab boycott. When the Arab League refused to recognize the State of Israel, they instituted a what they hoped would be a global boycott and blockade on the newly formed State of Israel. This has gone through many iterations. One form that it takes now is called BDS, Boycott, Divest, Sanction, which is a new repackaged version of the Arab boycott of the 1950s and 60s. We've seen increasing anti-Jewish attacks, especially in recent years. A big part of the motivation for these anti-Jewish attacks is the idea of white genocide. Among white supremacists, this idea of white genocide is this concept that somehow external forces are conspiring to eliminate, excuse me, to eliminate the so-called white race, and that Jews are often part of this conspiracy to do so. This is a big part of these movements that continue every couple of years. It's funny and sad that I have to keep updating this list, because now we have QAnon conspiracy theories. We have, I don't think that this is not a political statement, but there is a member of Congress who has said that in the past that she believes that the Rothschilds, a prominent Jewish family of the 20th century, created a laser to start California's forest fires, shot from outer space. And this is somebody who is a vocal, or has been a vocal supporter of the QAnon conspiracy theories. We also experience Islamic anti-Semitism, specifically Islamic anti-Zionism, which I'll talk about on the next slide, how to identify anti-Zionism. When is it anti-Semitism? The idea, some of the types of things you might hear repeated are Jews are the real Nazis because of the way Israelis treat Palestinians. This is where the type of context where you might hear this. Where have we seen Jews being renamed by their greatest rival? That goes all the way back to the Romans in the 2nd century, categorizing or projecting, it's not the word I'm looking for, projecting Jews as though they are in the place of our own greatest enemy. This is not a new thing. Anytime you say, make a comparison between Jews and Nazis, there is a deliberate act of anti-Semitism. We have a new form of anti-Semitism, that Jews are not the real Jews, that the Jewish people are pretenders to Judaism, and that there are groups that say no, in particular, Black Hebrew Israelites who claim that the Jewish people are not the real Jews, that in fact they are the real Jews. Or you see examples of, if you support Israel, you're not a real Jew, because there are, groups like, I'm not even going to repeat the name, but fringe groups of ultra-Orthodox Jews who oppose the state of Israel. And I'm talking fringe, fringe, fringe. This is not a feature of ultra-Orthodoxy, although the story there is much more complicated. There are fringe groups. In fact, I'm not even going to say ultra-Orthodox. I'm just going to say fringe Jewish groups that present themselves as though they are ultra-Orthodox, but in reality are rejected by ultra-Orthodoxy. That would be a more accurate way to say it. That oppose the state of Israel. How to recognize when criticism of Israel is actually anti-Semitism masquerading as legitimate political discourse. It's actually, in most cases, not that difficult. This is a standard that was developed and adopted by the US State Department. It's been adopted in many different other countries as well, called the 3 Ds of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. The first is demonization. When is Israel or Israelis are demonized or dehumanized in any sort of depiction or discussion. For example, when Israel is called an apartheid state. For example, when Israeli soldiers are called baby killers. These are examples of demonization. Delegitimization, denying that Israel has a legitimate right to exist. Some examples of this include calling Israel a European colony, that Israelis are colonizers of native Arab lands. This is a way of delegitimizing, saying that Jews don't have any historical tie to the land of Israel, and that the state of Israel itself is illegitimate. And finally, one of the most difficult to identify are double standards. Great example is if you look at the UN sanctions of the UN Human Rights Council, which is historically run by countries with some of the worst human rights records globally, who are actually in charge of running the United Nations Human Rights Council. You can see that the UN has, through the Human Rights Council, censured Israel hundreds of times and refuses to censure other nations who are behaving outside of international law. Does Israel sometimes behave outside of international law? Yes, I think that's undeniable. Are there other countries who also operate outside of the standards of international law? Yes, absolutely. You're sitting in one of them. In fact, most of the countries in the world sometimes have policies that operate outside of the standards of international law. But when the only country that is singled out for criticism is Israel, then you have the emergence of a double standard. So you have an example of what might be a legitimate criticism of a policy that is incorrect or even illegal, that is not using demonization or delegitimizing Israel, but in fact is extending a double standard for Israel as compared with any other nation in the world. Why? What is the motivation behind these? It's anti-Semitism. When Judaism was considered primarily a religion, the Jewish religion was demonized by the church and so on. When Judaism was considered primarily a race, it was the Jewish race that was demonized by the world. Now that there is a Jewish state, it is uniquely singled out for criticism among all of the nations of the world. And finally, I want to take a look at the Pyramid of Hate, which was developed, I believe, by the ACLU, and talks about the progression. How do we get to genocide? How does that actually happen? You might think, how does that happen in a civilized society? How do we get that far? We know what genocide is, but it's built on a base of other layers that lead up to that. This is a pattern that has been identified in multiple genocides on multiple continents, in different contexts, with different motivations and different methods of execution, that seems to always continuously follow this pattern. It begins with biased attitudes, which could include stereotyping, insensitive remarks, microaggressions, moving up to acts of bias, which include bullying, name-calling, using slurs, beginning dehumanization or biased or belittling jokes. These are the types of things that I can almost guarantee as Jews you'll see at some point in your life. We move up to discrimination, which you may encounter, but I hope you don't. Economic discrimination, somebody being denied a job. Political discrimination. There was recently, and I don't recall the university, I'd have to look it up, just 2 or 3 years ago, where a student was denied the right to be part of the student body government because they were Jewish and because they supported Israel. That is political discrimination. Educational discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination and segregation, and criminal justice disparities. Bias-motivated violence, murder, assault, arson, terrorism, vandalism. We also see some of this. They tend to be, at least for now, infrequent incidents of vandalism of Jewish buildings, vandalism of Jewish cemeteries, Jewish homes. But this is something that we see. What we don't see is the broad social acceptance of vandalism, arson, terrorism, violence against the Jewish community. As long as that violence continues to be unacceptable to society, then we can continue to fight it. That is what, when it becomes acceptable to society, that is when it has the potential to escalate to genocide. And this is not just applying to the Jewish people, but applying to any people in the world. All right, I know this was a long one. It's just about 6:30, but I am going to stop here for any discussion. I know there's probably a lot to process and some questions and comments to share.